Hi everyone, my name is Jonathan Morreale, and for my final project, I chose to look into labor trafficking, look into Asian garment manufacturing and outsourcing. The key issue I will be examining is the use of sweatshops and labor trafficking in apparel manufacturing. Specifically, this has become more of an issue in recent years since outsourcing became common practice for major US companies such as Nike or Adidas, and I'm going to place this into a locational context of Asia. So, to start off broadly, what is human trafficking? According to Amnesty International, uh, human trafficking can be defined as the recruitment, harboring, obtaining, and transportation of a person by use of fraud, force, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting them to involuntary acts. Our class definition of human trafficking is a crime against another person. This is the exploitation of another human being for economic gain of another party achieved through fraud, force, or coercion. The primary terms here to take into account are fraud, force, and coercion, which are present in all examples of human trafficking, as well as the fact that this is not a crime against a country's borders, but a crime against another person. A major outlet of human trafficking is labor trafficking. Labor trafficking, as defined by Amnesty International, is unfree labor and any work relation, especially in modern or early modern history, in which people are employed against their will with the threat of destitution, detention, violence, compulsion, or other forms of extreme hardship. There's many variances therein, such as labor camps or bonded labor. More specifically, though, I will be looking into the use of sweatshops, child labor, and improper working conditions in the garment manufacturing industry. Wrapping up context, a sweatshop can be defined as a workplace with very poor, socially unacceptable, or illegal working conditions in which the work may be difficult, dangerous, climatically challenging, or underpaid. The fashion industry is a major player in the use of outsourcing and the use of sweatshops and producing apparel, and this includes world-famous brands such as H&M, Nike, Adidas, Uniqlo, as well as more specifically the fast fashion market. Fast fashion is a newer trend characterized by rapid reorders and new orders that retailers exert as they discern sales trends in real time. These companies are reacting to arrange production accordingly with their minuscule schedule as they try and pump out cheap, affordable clothing as quickly as they can to match current trends. Mega corporations like Nike and Adidas have taken a large wave of criticism for their use of sweatshops. This started to come to a head at around the turn of the century when Adidas was criticized for their use of Indonesian sweatshops who were accused of underpayment, no overtime pay, physical abuse, and child labor, as well as Nike around the same time frame when they were accused of similar allegations. So, how are sweatshops and labor trafficking related? They are inherently different subjects, although they oftentimes become intertwined, and elements of labor trafficking and human trafficking are always present in sweatshops. Sweatshops do not necessarily involve the transportation nor the forced work of these individuals. However, sweatshops are always associated with very poor and unacceptable, oftentimes illegal working conditions in which workers are engaged in difficult, dangerous work. They're often underpaid and overworked. The International Labor Organization reports that factory workers in developing countries in Asia in the garment industry typically work anywhere from 11 to 13 hours per day, 6 days a week, with limited breaks for anything from the bathroom to a lunch break. Supervisors in these situations oftentimes have an authoritative rule over the factory workers, in which force can be commonly present in the situation. And child labor is a major issue within sweatshops, particularly in Asia. In 2013, the International Labor Organization reported that more than 170 million children were engaged in factory work in the textile and garment industry alone. Most of these child workers were females in their low teens. Why do people choose to work for sweatshops if not by force? Oftentimes it's coercion or fraud, the other two key elements of human trafficking and labor trafficking. There's no other job opportunities in these developing countries, and so despite the what we would consider in the United States to be terrible working conditions and unfair human rights violations, these individuals sometimes don't have other options. Because of this, they are able to or accept those low wages and long working hours as it's their only option. More specifically, with this issue, I want to discuss Nike's use of sweatshops. There was a large controversy at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s in which many widespread allegations came to public attention involving Nike's use of sweatshops in footwear and apparel manufacturing. These allegations included that they had been producing goods in Korea, China, and Taiwan in sweatshops since the early 1970s. Nike initially denied claims of their use of sweatshops, however, began to accept these claims and take responsibility as the time went on in the 2000s. Much of this was led by student activist groups at over 100 major United States universities. These student activist groups include United Students Against Sweatshops, and where over 1,000 students protested at 100 universities. Team Sweat, which was one of the largest groups that specifically tracks and protests Nike for their use of sweatshops. This was started by a soccer coach at St. John University who was later forced to resign due to his protests, as well as the Workers' Rights Consortium and Fair Labor Association. In this case, students at Georgetown University successfully protested the school's contract with Nike Apparel. In information published by NGOs such as the aforementioned, as well as the Global Exchange, Christian Aid, and Clean Clothes Campaign, and the Ethical Shopper, Nike was guilty of using sweatshops and where the supervisor of the factory often overstepped their duties and laws protecting workers were ignored in favors of cutting cost and lowering health and safety standards. There was also potential that these factories were paying off political leaders in their respective Asian countries to limit governmental interference, as well as that the factories were preventing their workers from unionizing. In these factories, 75 to 80% of the workers were female and in their teenage years, and these jobs required them to work anywhere from 9 to 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, and severely limited the amount of time they could take off of work or being forced to work overtime. More often than not, in these situations, these disenfranchised young women were coerced into a job, promised better pay and better working conditions than what any other job in their country could provide at the time, and were forced into working these long hours against their will. As a result of these protests, largely led by the student-led activist groups, legislation was passed in Indonesia, including the right to collective bargaining, limits on working hours per day, mandated rest periods, minimum age requirements for workers, and paid maternity leave. Nike began to monitor their working conditions in the factories and still spend over $10 million annually to enforce a code of conduct, as well as they began to contract with third-party factory auditors to investigate working conditions, in which they grade the factories on their working conditions and labor practices and terminate contracts with factories in non-compliance. These NGOs, largely led by college students, relied on new methods of communication and spreading awareness on a global scale. With the advent of internet communication as well as social media, these protesters were able to spread message that reached countries such as Indonesia and were able to spread awareness there where Indonesian factory workers protested outside of their own factories. This was coupled with the mass media attention that was garnered from such a large American corporation like Nike taking such fire for a controversial issue such as this. At this time, it was not previously in the mass media sphere for the American use of sweatshops and outsourcing, as well as the unfair labor practices that were demonstrated in these developing countries. However, the mass media jumped all over this, largely due to the protests outside of university buildings who had contracts with Nike, as well as protests outside of Nike office buildings and stores. In terms of communications, the demographic of these student and faculty led activist groups played a large role in the utilization of the internet and social media in spreading awareness. The students protested publicly by picketing and protesting outside of Nike office buildings and stores as well, which garnered mass media attention and publicity. However, then backed that with a huge social media and internet presence in which they were able to keep up with the rapidly expanding effect of globalization through the internet communication and spread information on a global scale incredibly rapidly. Some other major players in preventing and combating labor trafficking and the use of sweatshops in developing country are the International Labor Organization. They are an agency of the United Nations who provide regulations and impose restrictions upon countries in non-compliance with global labor standards. The Polaris Project, who is an NGO focused on combating and preventing modern-day slavery and human trafficking. API-GBV, who provides data and statistics on human trafficking and provides resources to victims, and Liberty Shared, an NGO that facilitates the sharing of information and data with anti-trafficking stakeholders. NGOs such as Liberty Shared become particularly important in this fight to combat labor trafficking, as they not only gather many different NGOs together at a time to place anti-trafficking efforts, but through the use of the internet and globalization are able to rapidly spread information and raise awareness on this issue. Some major theoretical perspectives to examine when looking at communication of both NGOs as well as corporations and governmental agencies in fighting labor trafficking are the neo-abolitionist perspective. The neo-abolitionist perspective is often referred to as modern-day slavery, which is a crime that wealthy governments and law enforcement agencies can prosecute and eradicate. The International Labor Organization commonly uses slavery rhetoric and imagery in order to call the public to duty, as well as assert their regulations over the perpetrators of labor trafficking. A lot of NGOs engage in neoliberalist perspectives in which they place pressure onto markets and corporations in order to create positive change. This was present in the Nike case study, in which NGOs such as the USAS were able to apply pressure both onto the consumer market as well as Nike to clean up their act or face large consequences. The neoliberalist perspective includes that consumer demand can apply adequate pressure on large corporations to avoid exploitative labor practices. These NGOs placed labor and placed media attention and focus onto corporations such as Nike in order to create positive change. And large corporations such as Nike often engage in cosmopolitanism, which is a branch of political theory that holds that the scope of morality is global and therefore the boundaries of nation states should not determine the reach of principles of social justice. Initially, when called to action in this case of the use of sweatshops and labor trafficking, Nike was ambivalent toward the issue, as they felt it was not their responsibility and they did not have any direct control over the practices of the factories in countries in Asia. However, their perspective changed as pressure was applied onto them, and they began to start producing rhetoric consistent with a global responsibility that is boundless, and where the privileged should intervene, and it is their duty to help those less fortunate. So why do sweatshops matter? According to Marley S. Weiss, as published in the Journal of Labor and Employment Law, human trafficking can but needs not involve movement or transportation. In this case, sweatshops do fall under the category of labor trafficking, particularly in developing countries, as factory workers are more often than not children and subjected to long working hours, poor working conditions, unsafe environments, and the use of fraud, force, and coercion into getting those jobs in the first place. According to Weiss, 68% of trafficking victims are coerced to work in activities including agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and domestic labor. And globally, there are 3 times as many labor trafficking victims as there are sex trafficking victims. The apparel industry alone, as published by Forbes in 2019, produced 368 billion US dollars of global revenue. It is an essential industry, and it is an industry that relies upon the use of sweatshops in manufacturing textiles and garments. And published by the International Labor Organization in 2013, 170 million children in developing countries were engaged in work with garment factories and textile producing factories.